everyone, welcome back to our third Let Me Read It to You so you don't have to video post. It's good to see you today. Today we're talking about student-centered learning and how this helps children master English. Student-centered learning is what our Australian national curriculum is actually based on. And it's a change from the past where the emphasis was on the teacher imparting knowledge and the student taking it in. You know, with student-centered learning, it's not about the teacher. It's about focusing on what the student needs, what they can do, what areas we can support them in to see learning and development. You know, with this approach, we shift the focus, encouraging students to be more active in their own learning. When it comes to English, one size doesn't fit all. This is not the approach to go for. Every child is different. You know, what excites one student might bore another. That's where student-centered learning comes in. Instead of focusing on kids following those rigid lesson plans, student-centered learning puts their interests, strengths, and needs at the core of education. And when children feel heard and understood, their motivation and confidence in English just skyrocket. This brings us to our first segment. What is student-centered learning? Student-centered learning is an approach where students play an active role in their education. Instead of passively listening to a teacher deliver information, kids engage in lessons tailored to their learning styles, interests, and pace. You know, the goal is to make learning more meaningful and enjoyable so students develop that deeper connection with the subject. In this case, it's English. Let me tell you a little bit about my personal experience with student-centered learning. So throughout my schooling in Australia, I had a lot of different teachers. Some were forgettable, but the ones who really made a difference stood out. What made them special? They focused on my learning, my interests, and made lessons feel personal. I remember in grade 4, my teacher knew I loved reading stories and novels. I always had my head in a book. Instead of just assigning generic writing tasks, they introduced an activity where we made our own books. I was ecstatic. I was so happy. Over the course of that 2 weeks, I honestly must have made about 7 books. All of them properly bound and put together and everything. And I honestly still remember how exciting this felt. To truly be seen as a student and how my teacher actually did something that they knew I would love in the classroom. I still remember it, honestly. And it sticks with me today. It showed me how powerful student-centered learning can be. When teachers take the time to understand what excites their students, learning stops feeling like a chore and it actually becomes something that kids genuinely enjoy. This brings us to our next segment, why student learning works for English. Okay, so we know English is more than just grammar, rules, and vocabulary lists. It's about communication, creativity, and confidence, A student-centered learning approach allows kids to engage with English in a way that feels natural and meaningful to them. And I've got 4 little reasons to share with you as to why it's effective. Reason number 1, it makes learning personal. Very, very important. Every child has different strengths. Some love storytelling, some enjoy debating, and others prefer hands-on activities. By tailoring English lessons to these preferences, children stay engaged and they develop a genuine interest in learning the language. Point number 2 for how it helps, it builds confidence. This is important. When kids feel their opinions and interests matter, they are more likely to speak up and participate. In an English classroom, this means more opportunities to practice speaking, writing, and thinking critically, which are key skills for mastering the language. Point number 3 for how it helps, it encourages active learning. Student-centered learning moves away from that passive listening and towards active participation. Whether through group discussions, creative projects, or real-world problem-solving tasks, kids learn by doing, rather than just memorizing. This is important. Point number 4, the final one, how does it help? It increases engagement and motivation. Children are naturally curious, but traditional rote learning methods can actually really stifle that curiosity. When kids have a say in what and how they learn, they become more invested in their education and they're more likely to stick with it in the long term. This brings us to our main points. How can parents support student-centered learning at home? Let me give you 4 recommendations. 1, encourage exploration. If your child is interested in space, animals, cooking, use those interests to introduce new English vocabulary and reading materials. When we're learning English, it doesn't need to be us just sitting there with a textbook. Make it fun. Point 2, let them make choices. Give your child some control over their learning. Let them choose the books that they read, the topics they read about, or even the way that they practice speaking. Maybe recording it in a funny way, stuff like this. Give them choice. Point number 3, celebrate their strengths. Not all kids will excel at English in the same way. Some might be amazing storytellers, while others have strong listening comprehension. Recognize and encourage their individual strengths instead of focusing only on weaknesses. We don't want a deficit mindset. We want a strengths-based positive mindset here. That's what's going to help. Point number 4, foster a positive learning environment. We know this one. A supportive, low-pressure environment is key. Mistakes are part of the learning process, and children need to feel safe to make those mistakes. This brings us to final thoughts for this article. When we put children at the center of their learning, they engage more, enjoy the process, and they develop a deeper understanding of English. At GKEA, we believe in student-centered teaching because it builds confidence and it makes our students feel prepared and ready to just keep trying. Mistakes are a good thing. So here at GKEA, we want our students to feel comfortable to make as many as they need to. But I hope you have enjoyed our 3rd video. I will see you in the next one, everyone. Goodbye.